Welcome to Module 4. This week we'll be talking about the art and architecture of ancient Egypt. And this lecture will serve as an introduction to some of the main concepts that we need to consider when looking at the art of Egypt, and also an overview of the history. Last week, when we considered the civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia, we have to remember that although these were very advanced civilizations and we saw some amazing innovations, they sometimes were very short-lived. And one civilization might be overtaken by another. And we saw some degree of chaos in terms of not the government, systems of government shifting from one society to another. When we look at Egypt, we have to understand that one of the remarkable things is the longevity of this society. Ancient Egyptian civilization lasted for more than 3,000 years and showed an amazing continuity. Just to put that in perspective, that is more than 15 times the age of the United States. And if we think about a lot of the innovations that have come into our lives in the last couple of decades, technology and communication like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, not to mention iPhones and streaming devices, all of these things have happened remarkably recently for us. And we understand that our lives are fairly different from our grandparents or their grandparents. This was not the case for your typical Egyptian. They viewed the world as being fairly stable and static. They understood that their lives might not be very different from their ancestors who lived thousands of years ago, and that their descendants in 1,000 years, they could assume, would be fairly similar. And Egypt's stability is really in contrast to the Mesopotamian region of the same period, which, as I said, endured overlapping cultures and upheavals with amazing regularity. So when we look at the forms of the art of Egypt, to the untrained eye, Egyptian art doesn't seem to change much for thousands of years. And this is intentional. The vast amount of Egyptian imagery, especially royal imagery, was guided by conventions and decorum, and it was incredibly consistent throughout its history. And I'm demonstrating this by showing you two images of almost 2,000 years apart. The first is a detail from the Palette of Narmer, which is one of the first objects we'll be looking at. And we see a king with a profile face and a frontal chest in a gesture of power, striking down an enemy. If we look forward almost 2,000 years later to Ramses III, we see that some of these conventions still hold. He's using the same gesture, the same conventions for depicting the human form. So again, we have to be a pretty specialized expert in Egyptian art to understand that these are from not just two different periods, but two different periods that are thousands of years apart. And this is why their art appears extremely static in terms of symbols, gestures, the way the body is rendered. It was very static, and this was intentional. The Egyptians were aware of this consistency, and they viewed it as stability. They viewed it as balance and clear evidence of the correctness and superiority of their culture. We also need to understand that this is a culture that is centered around the afterlife. And this consistency we see, the stability, the static nature of the art, is really closely linked to a fundamental belief that depictions had an impact beyond the image itself. For example, a tomb scene of the deceased receiving food must have all of the food required for that deceased person. If it lacked, for instance, a loaf of bread, that meant that that person would not have bread for eternity. All of these objects were needed to create a divine realm that was functionally working. If the king, for example, did not have the right implements for a ritual, that ritual would be incorrect and would have dire consequences in the future. All of these beliefs led to an active resistance to change in the form, in codified depictions of rulers. We should also understand that ancient Egypt was evolving and overlapping time-wise with some of the civilizations of Mesopotamia we have discussed. At the same time city-states were forming in Mesopotamia, we see the beginnings of Egypt rising along the Nile. So we have looked at this Fertile Crescent area, which includes, of course, Sumer and Akkadian, Babylon, Assyria, the Assyrian kingdom, and of course down over here the Persian kingdom, Persian Empire. We are looking over here at the Nile, a very important backbone of the Egyptian culture. People start settling in the Nile River Valley around 8000 BCE. This is a very fertile area that had natural resources like fish and game and wild plants. Around 5500, agricultural Neolithic villages start to emerge. And remember that agriculture appears earlier in Mesopotamia, around 9000 BCE. It happens much later, several thousand years later, in Egypt. And that is because essentially they did not need it. This was such a fertile area with natural resources that they were doing okay without agriculture for several thousand years. Now, as I mentioned, the Nile is the backbone of Egypt. And this is, I'm not just speaking about geographically or in terms of resources. Culturally, it also is the backbone of Egyptian life, society, history, and culture. It's almost viewed as a creative force in ancient Egypt. It supplies reliable soil, and it is a very predictable river, which provided stability. It had predictable, reliable flood patterns, as opposed to, say, the Tigris and Euphrates, which flooded all the time, and it created a lot of chaos. The Nile flooded every September and left behind a fertile, boggy soil when it retreated in November. And this resulted in an annual surplus of crops, which provided a prosperous society, a large population that could count on its agriculture. It also is literally a highway that unites Upper and Lower Egypt. And Upper Egypt is down here. Lower Egypt is up here in the north. This is a little confusing, but just remember that Lower Egypt is above Upper Egypt. And because of this, they didn't have to go outside the region for a lot of natural resources. They didn't have to go outside the region for building materials either. They had stone for architecture, and there were great limestone quarries up here around Giza, which is where the pyramids were built. They had clay for pottery, thanks to the Nile. They had gold used for ornamentation. They could also easily find copper in the Sinai Peninsula over here, and they could go up to the northeast to Lebanon for timber. Although they didn't really need timber, they had building materials. Like Mesopotamia, Egypt is a place of a lot of innovation and many firsts. For example, they invented the column, which is a major fundamental building block of architecture and influenced the Greeks. Latrines, a wood joining building method that we still use today. In fact, lots of different wood joining methods. and a form of writing called hieroglyphics. And once hieroglyphics are established, we see lots of documentation. We find out a lot from Egyptian culture, from their love of writing. There's a special branch of archaeology devoted just to the study of ancient Egypt, and we call that Egyptology. It's a modern discipline that started in the 18th century when archaeological explorations of the Nile began in earnest. And this really starts with Napoleon Bonaparte, who in 1799 took a small troop of scholars, linguists, and artists with him on a military expedition. And they found, really by accident, an object that's come to be known as the Rosetta Stone. And this is a remarkable artifact that is now located in the British Museum. It's really the key to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphic writing. It shows what was assumed to be the same text in 3 different languages. Greek, which the scholars knew and could translate, Demotic, which is a late Egyptian script, and one in formal hieroglyphics. So they figured out from this that hieroglyphics were not simple pictographs, but the written form of a spoken language. Much of the history of ancient Egypt and its culture was kind of forgotten during the Middle Ages, and it was with this resurgence of interest in Egypt and also in ancient texts that much of what we know was revived from looking at ancient texts. Much of what we know comes from these 2 writings. One is from Manetho, who was a 3rd century BCE Egyptian priest, and the other is from the Greek scholar and traveler Herodotus from the 5th century BCE. Neither of these texts are really reliable. Manetho was very much caught up in the propaganda of different dynasties, and so his dating is very much off. We can't really trust the dates that he gives us. Herodotus, being a Greek scholar, gives us different names of pharaohs, Greek names as opposed to Egyptian names, and possibly didn't understand that several names were given to the same ruler. Nevertheless, this gives us a basis for later scholars who start to sketch out a history of periods in ancient Egypt. We start with the pre-dynastic, which is really when the Neolithic villages start to evolve, from starting in 5500 BCE. Then we look at the early dynasty, and this is a period where ancient Egypt really starts to form and is signaled by the unification of the lower Egypt with the upper Egypt, and unification under one king. And this brings us to the Old Kingdom, which is a large period that encompasses many of the symbols that we think of when we think of ancient Egypt, like the pyramids. That's followed by an intermediate period. And by intermediate period, we are referring to a period in which the systems sort of break down, and there are relatively short periods of chaos. The Middle Kingdom starts in 2040 BCE and goes until about 1782 BCE. Again, it ends in another period of relative chaos when the dynastic system breaks down for a short time. This is the second intermediate period. And finally, it ends with the New Kingdom,